I remember exactly where I was when she said it, standing barefoot in the kitchen of our modest colonial house in Westchester, New York. The maple floorboards felt cool against my feet despite the July heat. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains Mom had sewn herself years ago, casting dappled patterns across the countertops. I was watching her chop vegetables for Sunday dinner, the rhythmic sound of knife hitting cutting board almost hypnotic, when everything changed. The day had begun like any other. I'd woken up late, shuffled downstairs in my pajamas, and found Mom already busy with her weekend routine. Dad was out golfing with Uncle Rick, as he always was on Sundays. The baseball game played softly on the small kitchen TV, the Yankees trailing in the fifth inning. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to suggest that my entire life was about to be upended. We'd been talking about nothing important, my plans for graduate school, whether the hydrangeas needed more fertilizer, when Mom suddenly stopped chopping. Her hands went still, and she gripped the knife a little tighter, her knuckles whitening against the wooden handle. "Emma," she said, my name sounding foreign in her mouth. "There's something I need to tell you." Something in her voice made me look up. She wasn't looking at me, but rather at some invisible point beyond the kitchen window. "What is it?" I asked, reaching for my coffee mug, still blissfully unaware. She took a deep breath, and the words tumbled out, "You're not my real daughter." Time stalled. The knife paused mid-slice. I felt the floor tilt beneath me as if our house had suddenly been set adrift. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, but didn't shatter. It landed on the rubber mat with a dull thud, coffee splashing onto my bare feet. I barely felt it. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was flat, resigned, as though she were delivering banal news about a canceled appointment rather than shattering my world. That's what struck me the most. How could she say something so monumental with such detachment? My stomach clenched, and the air around me tasted metallic. I pressed my fingertips to my lips, willing them not to tremble. The betrayal was already seeping into my bones, turning my blood to ice despite the summer heat. "What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice barely audible over the drone of the baseball announcer describing a double play. She resumed chopping, the rhythmic sound now grating against my nerves. "I thought you should know before you leave for Columbia in the fall. Your father," she hesitated, the word hanging between us, suddenly questionable. "Jack didn't want to tell you. He thought it would be better if you never knew." Questions erupted in my mind like shards of glass. If I wasn't her daughter, who was I? Why tell me now, at 22, after all these years? Why today, in this sun-drenched kitchen that suddenly felt like a stranger's home? Each question echoed louder than the last, leaving me raw, exposed, undone. I looked at my hands, searching for signs that they belonged to someone else. The birthmark on my right wrist, the one Mom always said looked like a tiny heart, was it evidence of another woman's genes? The freckles scattered across my forearms like constellations, were they inherited from a stranger? When I finally forced myself to speak again, my voice came out as a whisper I barely recognized. "Then, what am I?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would change everything. She averted her gaze, cutting vegetables again with mechanical precision, as if slicing carrots could somehow sever the bond she'd just severed. "You're adopted, Emma. We got you when you were 3 months old." 3 months. I repeated numbly. "So I have. I have other parents." "A birth mother," she corrected, still not looking at me. "We never knew who your father was. It was a closed adoption through St. Catherine's in Manhattan." The TV droned on in the background. Someone had hit a home run, and the crowd roared with excitement. The sound was jarring against the quiet devastation unfolding in our kitchen. "Does anyone else know?" I asked, thinking of Thanksgiving dinners with extended family, of Grandma Ruth pinching my cheeks and saying I had the Sullivan nose. "Your grandparents. Aunt Caroline. A few others." She shrugged, as if the list were inconsequential. "We decided it was best to keep it private." Private. The word stung. My own identity had been kept private from me. I felt for the kitchen chair behind me and sank into it, my legs suddenly unable to hold my weight. 22 years of family photos flashed through my mind. Christmas mornings, beach vacations in Cape Cod, my high school graduation. All those moments, viewed through a lens of assumed biology, now required reframing. Why tell me now? I asked, my voice stronger now, edged with the first hints of anger. Mom, or the woman I'd always called Mom, finally set down the knife and turned to face me. For the first time, I noticed how little we resembled each other. Her eyes were hazel, mine blue. Her nose straight and narrow, mine slightly upturned. How had I never questioned it? You're starting a new chapter, she said quietly. And I couldn't bear the thought of you finding out from someone else. Medical records, maybe, or a slip of the tongue at a family gathering. In that moment, I understood. Nothing would ever be the same. The kitchen, with its familiar smells and sounds, had become foreign territory. The woman standing before me, the woman who had bandaged my skinned knees and stayed up with me during thunderstorms, was suddenly a stranger. I stood up, coffee still dripping from the hem of my pajama pants, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Behind me, I heard the knife resume its rhythm against the cutting board, as if nothing momentous had occurred. As if she hadn't just rewritten the first chapter of my life with a few casual sentences on a Sunday afternoon. The next morning, everything looked different. Sunlight still streamed through my bedroom curtains, the neighbor's dog still barked at the mailman, and Mom still made coffee in the kitchen downstairs. I could smell the dark roast wafting up to my room. But the familiar contours of my life had shifted overnight, like furniture rearranged in the dark. I waited until I heard Dad leave for work, his car backing out of the driveway with its distinctive grumble. I couldn't face him yet. Did he look at me differently, knowing I wasn't his? Did he resent the years spent raising another man's child? These questions felt like stones in my stomach, too heavy to carry downstairs. When I finally emerged from my room, I avoided the kitchen and Mom's inevitable, "Good morning, sweetheart." Instead of greeting her with my usual kiss on the cheek, I slipped out the side door and walked to Blackstone Park, where I sat on a bench watching strangers jog past. Each face made me wonder, could one of these people be related to me by blood? Sarah called while I was at the park, my best friend since 6th grade, when we bonded over our shared love of Harry Potter and hatred of Ms. Gillespie's math class. For a moment, I considered telling her everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "You okay, Em?" she asked after my third monosyllabic response. "You sound weird." "Just tired," I lied, watching a squirrel dart up an oak tree. "Didn't sleep well." When I returned home hours later, Mom was in the garden, pruning her beloved roses. She looked up hopefully as I approached. Secateur paused mid-cut. "Emma, I was thinking we could talk more about. I have plans with Sarah," I said quickly, though Sarah and I had no such plans. I brushed past her, my shoulder deliberately avoiding contact with hers, and retreated to my room, letting the door click shut behind me like a verdict. That evening, she left a mug of chamomile tea outside my bedroom, my favorite when I was upset, with a drizzle of honey and a slice of lemon. I let it grow cold, a small rebellion that felt enormous in the moment. At dinner, I pushed food around my plate, answering Dad's questions about my day with non-committal shrugs. He glanced at Mom, confusion etched in the lines around his eyes, but neither of them pushed. Each act of withdrawal was small, almost imperceptible, yet every omission felt monumental to me, as if erasing myself from their lives bit by bit. I stopped helping with dinner. I declined invitations to watch our favorite shows together. I left my bed unmade, clothes scattered across the floor, a visual representation of my internal disarray that I knew would bother Mom's fastidious nature. They noticed. Dad's attempts at conversation grew more forced, his jokes more desperate. Mom's glances became furtive, laced with confusion and a fragile hurt I hadn't expected to feel. One evening, a week after her revelation, she stood at my bedroom door, hesitating, as though unsure whether to knock or flee. "Emma?" Her voice was soft, tentative. When I didn't answer, she continued anyway. "I made lasagna. Your favorite." My stomach growled traitorously. I hadn't eaten properly in days. "I'm not hungry," I lied, turning up the volume on my laptop where Netflix played a show I wasn't really watching. She lingered a moment longer. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked. Why are you shutting me out? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken emotion. I could have answered then, could have unleashed the tornado of hurt and betrayal swirling inside me. But I couldn't do it without exposing the raw nerve of my pain. So I remained silent, letting the gulf widen between us. I love you, Emma, she said finally, her words barely audible through the door. Nothing changes that. But everything had changed. The woman I'd called Mom for 22 years had kept the most fundamental truth about my existence from me. How many other lies lay buried beneath that one? That silence became my armor. I immersed myself in late-night research, looking up adoption laws in New York State, reading forums where adult adoptees shared their stories of discovery and reconnection. Some of their experiences were comforting, others terrifying. Many described the same sense of dislocation I felt, as if they'd been living in a house with a false wall, only to discover entire rooms they never knew existed. I poured the shards of my shattered trust onto paper, filling journal pages with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask aloud. Who is my birth mother? Why did she give me up? Do I have siblings somewhere? Does she ever think of me? The questions multiplied with each passing day, breeding in the silence I maintained. My withdrawal extended beyond home. I canceled plans with friends, ignored texts from my summer internship supervisor, and declined a weekend trip to Boston that Sarah had been planning for months. The world beyond my identity crisis seemed trivial, distant. You're being weird, Emma. Sarah confronted me on the phone after my third canceled coffee date. Is this about Jason? Because breaking up with that loser should have you celebrating, not hibernating. I almost laughed. My relationship with Jason Forrester, 3 mediocre months that ended when I caught him kissing Sophie Banks at Mark's graduation party, seemed like a lifetime ago. How could Sarah understand that my entire sense of self had been appended? That the face I saw in the mirror now belonged to a stranger? It's not about Jason, I said, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, tracing the glow-in-the-dark stars Dad had stuck there when I was 8. Were small acts of fatherly love like that enough to make him my real dad? It's family stuff. I can't really talk about it yet. Since when do you have family stuff? Your family is like boringly functional. Sarah laughed, the sound grating against my raw emotions. By replaying Mom's confession over and over, dissecting each inflection, each syllable, I began to regain a sense of control. I noticed details I'd missed in the initial shock. How her hands trembled slightly when she mentioned St. Catherine's, how she avoided using the word real when referring to my birth mother, how she'd said, we decided it was best to keep it private. A collective decision that excluded me. 2 weeks into my self-imposed isolation, Dad knocked on my door late one evening. Unlike Mom's tentative taps, his knock was firm, decisive. Emma, this has gone on long enough, he said when I reluctantly opened the door. His normally jovial face was creased with worry, making him look older than his 52 years. Your mother is beside herself. She's not my mother, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Dad's face hardened. Don't you ever say that again, he said, his voice low and fierce. She raised you. She loved you from the moment she first held you. Biology doesn't make a parent, Emma. Love does. His words settled uncomfortably in my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell him that love should include honesty, that real parents don't keep their children's origins secret for 2 decades. But something in his expression stopped me, a vulnerability I rarely saw in my stoic, easygoing father. Why didn't you tell me? I asked instead, the question barely audible. Dad sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. We thought we were protecting you. Maybe we were wrong. He hesitated, then added, but shutting us out isn't the answer. Whatever questions you have, we'll try to answer them. Just don't pull away, Em. Please. That night, I cried for the first time since Mom's revelation, not the angry, hot tears I'd expected, but quiet, confused ones that soaked my pillow until dawn. By refusing to act like their daughter, I'd felt the first stirrings of control in a situation where I had none. But Dad's visit had cracked my armor, leaving me uncertain whether my withdrawal was punishing them or only hurting myself. August arrived with a suffocating heat wave that matched the intensity of my search for answers. 3 weeks had passed since Mom's revelation, and while I'd begun speaking to my parents again, stilted, superficial conversations over dinner, I remained consumed by the need to uncover the truth of my origins. One sweltering Tuesday afternoon, when both Mom and Dad were at work, I ventured into our dusty attic. The air was thick and hot, carrying the musty scent of forgotten things. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I rummaged through cardboard boxes labeled in Mom's neat handwriting, Christmas decorations, tax records 2010 to 2015, Emma baby clothes. I paused at that one, my fingers tracing my name. Opening it, I found tiny onesies, knitted booties, and a small yellow blanket with ducks embroidered in the corners. Had my birth mother wrapped me in this blanket? Or was it something Mom, Claire, I'd started calling her in my mind, had bought in anticipation of my arrival? Moving deeper into the attic's recesses, I found what I was looking for, a metal filing cabinet tucked behind Dad's old golf clubs. The top drawer stuck slightly, requiring a firm tug to open. Inside were folders organized alphabetically. Adoption papers would be under A, I reasoned, but found nothing there. After 30 minutes of increasingly desperate searching, I discovered a folder labeled simply EMS. My initials. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a birth certificate I'd never seen before, stamped with a name that stirred the faintest echo of recognition, Emma Marie Shapiro. Not Sullivan. Shapiro. The weight of that revelation, a different surname, a different identity, made me sink to the attic floor, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams around me. The birth mother's name was Rachel Shapiro, age 19 at the time of my birth. Father, unknown. Place of birth, Mount Sinai Hospital, New York City, just 2 hours from the suburban home where I'd been raised thinking I belonged. Beneath the birth certificate lay adoption paperwork, legal documents with signatures that weren't Claire's or Jack's. They belonged to a woman I'd never met. Rachel's signature was hurried, almost reluctant, the letters bunched together as if she couldn't bear to space them out properly. Each discovery sent tremors of disbelief through me, but also a strange sense of relief, confirmation that my identity was mine to reclaim. I wasn't crazy for feeling disconnected from the Sullivans. There was a reason my eyes were blue when both Claire and Jack had brown eyes. A reason I excelled at math while they both struggled with numbers. A reason I never quite fit into the mold they'd created for me. I photographed every document with shaking hands before carefully returning the folder to its hiding place. Then I carried my newfound knowledge back to my bedroom, where I spread the photos across my desk like puzzle pieces of a life I'd never known I had. The name Rachel Shapiro became my obsession. I searched social media platforms, scrolling through dozens of profiles until my eyes burned. I checked alumni databases for universities in the New York area, reasoning that if she was 19 when I was born, she might have been a student somewhere nearby. Late nights turned into early mornings as I hunched over my laptop, tracking down every lead, no matter how tenuous. I created accounts on genealogy websites, cross-referenced public records, and even considered hiring a private investigator with the money I'd saved for graduate school textbooks. A breakthrough came through an obscure Jewish genealogy forum where I'd posted under a pseudonym, seeking information about the Shapiro family in New York. A user named Brooklyn Roots 87 sent me a private message. The Shapiros owned a bookstore in Park Slope until about 15 years ago. Rachel worked there summers during high school. Park Slope. I'd been there once on a school trip to the Brooklyn Museum. Had I walked past my birth mother's family bookstore without knowing it? The thought made my stomach clench. Brooklyn Roots 87 provided the store's name, Shapiro's Literary Corner, and mentioned that after it closed, Ruth Shapiro, presumably Rachel's mother, had moved to a retirement community in New Jersey. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd had before. After days of calls to retirement communities across New Jersey, each one a dead end, I finally located Ruth Shapiro at Sunset Gardens in Montclair. The receptionist was reluctant to connect me at first. "Mrs. Shapiro doesn't take unsolicited calls," she explained. "Who may I say is calling?" I hesitated, heart pounding. "Emma," I said finally. "Emma Shapiro. I believe I'm her granddaughter." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then, "One moment, please." Minutes later, a voice came on the line, elderly, slightly accented, but sharp. "Who is this really?" she demanded without preamble. My mouth went dry. "My name is Emma Sullivan," I admitted. "But I was born Emma Marie Shapiro. Rachel Shapiro is my birth mother." I'm trying to find her." Another silence, this one heavier. "How did you find me?" The question wasn't hostile, just cautious. I explained about the genealogy forum, the bookstore, the trail that had led me to her. As I spoke, I heard her breathing change, becoming shallower, quicker. "Rachel doesn't know I'm calling," I added quickly. "I don't even know if she wants to hear from me. But I just found out I was adopted, and my voice broke. I need to know where I come from." Mrs. Shapiro, my grandmother, if genetics meant anything, sighed deeply. "Rachel has wondered about you every day for 22 years, she said finally. "She would want to know you're looking for her." She gave me a phone number with a Boston area code. "Rachel teaches at Emerson College now," she explained. "English literature. She's not married, no other children." The way she emphasized other made my heart stutter. "Call her. She'll want to hear from you." My fingers hovered above my phone for hours that evening, heart pounding, until I finally dialed the number that felt like destiny. When her voice answered, soft, hesitant, undeniably familiar in a way I couldn't explain, I felt tears spill down my cheeks. "Is this Rachel Shapiro?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Yes, this is Professor Shapiro." "Who's calling, please?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Emma Sullivan. I was born Emma Marie Shapiro on April 12, 2002, at Mount Sinai Hospital." My voice shook. "I think you might be my mother." The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear her breathing, quick, irregular, and what might have been a stifled sob. "Emma," she finally whispered, her voice breaking on those two syllables. "Is it really you?" We talked for 3 hours that night. Rachel told me how she'd been a sophomore at NYU when she got pregnant, how her boyfriend had left when he found out, how her parents had pushed her to consider adoption when she'd wanted to keep me. "I was too young, too broke, too scared," she explained, her voice thick with regret. The Sullivans seemed so perfect, stable, loving, financially secure. Everything I couldn't give you then. I listened, hungry for every detail of the story I'd never known was mine. When she asked about my life, I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, not just the factual milestones of grades and achievements, but the deeper truths of who I'd become. We agreed to meet the following weekend. I told my parents, because despite everything, that's still what they were, that I was visiting Sarah in Boston. It wasn't a complete lie. Sarah was studying summer courses at BU and had offered her dorm room floor when I'd finally confided in her about finding my birth mother. The cafe where we arranged to meet was small, cramped, smelling of stale coffee and cinnamon. I arrived 30 minutes early, claiming a corner table where I could watch the door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, rattling the ceramic mug of chai tea I wasn't actually drinking. When she walked in, I knew her immediately. It wasn't just the blue eyes, my eyes, or the slight upturn of her nose. It was something in the way she moved, hesitant but purposeful, scanning the room with an intensity one recognized from my own reflection. Our eyes met across the crowded space. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she was walking toward me, and I was standing, and somehow we were embracing as if we'd known each other forever instead of for mere seconds. "You look like my father," were her first words, spoken into my hair as she held me. "Your grandfather. He would have loved you so much." We spent hours in that cafe, talking until our voices grew hoarse. Rachel laid out the reasons she'd relinquished me, circumstances of youth and desperation, not rejection. She showed me photos of herself at 19, her rounded belly visible beneath a NYU sweatshirt, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "I wrote you letters," she confessed. "Every year on your birthday. I never sent them because the adoption was closed, but I kept them all." She pushed a small package across the table, a bundle of envelopes tied with blue ribbon. "They're yours now." As I held those letters, physical proof that I'd been thought of, remembered, loved by someone connected to me by blood, I felt the fractured pieces of my soul start to knit together. Not erasing the pain of Claire's revelation, but forming something new alongside it, a sense of self I never knew I craved. By the time we parted that evening, plans already made to meet again, I understood that finding Rachel hadn't given me all the answers. But it had given me something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that my story was bigger than the lie I'd been told, that my identity was mine to discover, one truth at a time. September brought crisp mornings and the steady rhythm of falling leaves in Westchester. As summer faded, so did the person I'd been before learning the truth. Meeting Rachel had shifted something fundamental within me, not erasing 22 years of being Emma Sullivan, but adding dimensions I'd never known were missing. I returned to my parents' house different. Not just emotionally, but physically. The day after meeting Rachel, I'd wandered into a salon in Boston's Newbury Street and emerged with hair dyed a fiery auburn, Rachel's natural color, though I hadn't consciously made the connection until the stylist held up the mirror. "Whoa," Sarah had said when she saw me. "Break-up hair. Classic move." But it wasn't about Jason, or even about rebellion. It was about claiming something that felt authentically mine. The woman in the mirror with bright copper hair looked more like me than the brunette I'd been all my life. Mom, Claire, had gone pale when I walked through the door. "Your beautiful hair," she'd whispered, reaching out as if to touch it before letting her hand fall away. "It's just hair," I'd replied, though we both knew it wasn't. My wardrobe transformed next. I abandoned the muted neutrals Claire had always encouraged, so classic, honey, for bold prints and textures I'd always been drawn to but never quite brave enough to wear. Vintage band t-shirts from a thrift store in Greenwich Village. A leather jacket found at a Brooklyn flea market. Silver rings for each finger, purchased from a street vendor outside Washington Square Park. Each new piece felt like a declaration, not just of independence, but of integration. The external changes reflected the internal shifts happening as I reconciled the person I'd been raised to be with the person I might have become under different circumstances. Rachel and I met every few weeks, each encounter revealing new connections between us. We shared a love of dystopian fiction, an inability to fold fitted sheets, and an obsessive attention to grammar. She laughed the same way I did, head thrown back, no sound at first, then a rush of breath. Our hands made the same unconscious gestures when we spoke. Nature versus nurture in real time, she'd mused during our third meeting, watching me absently twirl a strand of hair around my finger, exactly as she was doing. Through Rachel, I'd gained access to a family history I'd never known. Jewish grandparents who'd fled Poland before World War II, a great-grandfather who'd written poetry in Yiddish, the genetic source of my blue eyes, Rachel's father, who died when she was in college. These details weren't just facts, they were missing pieces of myself, slotting into place with satisfying clicks. I didn't tell Claire and Jack about Rachel. Not yet. Those Sunday dinners in the familiar dining room now felt like performances where I played the role of daughter while harboring a secret self they couldn't see. I'd catch Dad studying me sometimes, his brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile the Emma he knew with this new, unfamiliar version. "You seem different," he remarked one evening as I loaded the dishwasher, a chore I'd recently reclaimed as a peace offering. "Happier, maybe?" I'd shrugged, not ready to explain that happiness wasn't quite the right word. What I felt was more complex, a tentative wholeness, as if I discovered rooms in a house I thought I knew completely. The most profound changes happened internally. I rediscovered passions I'd shelved for fear of disappointing the woman who'd never truly been mine. Painting, which Rachel revealed ran in the family, hiking the rugged trails of the Hudson Valley, where the physical exertion matched my emotional turbulence. Writing poetry that I showed to no one, filling notebooks with raw verses about identity and belonging. I deferred my acceptance to Columbia's graduate program, the path Claire and Jack had always assumed I'd take, and applied instead to Emerson's creative writing program. If accepted, I'd be in Boston, closer to Rachel, but far enough from Westchester to breathe. "You're making a mistake," Claire had said when I told them about deferring Columbia, her voice tight with disapproval. That program has been your dream since sophomore year. No, I'd wanted to say. It was your dream for me. But I held my tongue, unwilling to ignite that particular fire just yet. Instead, I enrolled in a local art workshop at the community center in Tarrytown. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I lost myself in canvases splashed with color and emotion. The instructor, Eliza, was a retired art professor from RISD with silver dreadlocks and hands permanently stained with paint. "You've got good instincts," she told me during our third session, studying my abstract interpretation of a still life. "But you're holding back. What are you afraid of?" The question lingered long after class ended. What was I afraid of? Making a mess? Going too far? Being seen too clearly? All of it, probably. I'd spent my life coloring inside the lines Claire had drawn for me. In the studio's cramped corners, friendships blossomed with people who knew nothing of my complicated history. Alejandro, a tattoo artist working on his fine art portfolio, Deepti, an accountant who painted in secret until her divorce freed her to pursue her passion, Marcus, a retired bus driver whose landscapes captured the soul of the Hudson River. "What brings you here, Em?" Deepti asked once over cheap wine at a nearby bar after class. They'd taken to calling me Em, not Emma, another small but significant shift in identity. "I'm figuring out who I am," I'd answered honestly, surprising myself with the admission. Marcus had nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Aren't we all?" I drove a bus for 40 years, pretending I wasn't an artist. Now I'm making up for lost time. Their acceptance of my exploration, their own parallel journeys of self-discovery, made me feel less alone. For the first time, I found myself surrounded by people who celebrated my quirks rather than questioning them, who saw my changes as evolution rather than rebellion. Rachel supported my artistic endeavors with an enthusiasm that Claire had never quite managed. "Creativity runs in our blood," she'd said when I showed her photos of my paintings. My father would spend hours sketching the Brooklyn skyline from our apartment window. With each passing day, I woke feeling lighter, as though I'd shed a layer of imposed identity. The grief of Claire's betrayal lingered like a faint scar, but beneath it pulsed a newfound resilience. I was no longer defined by her denial. I was defined by the choices I made and the truth I embraced. October brought an acceptance letter from Emerson for the spring semester. I'd be starting fresh in January, in a new city, carrying both my histories with me. The night the email came through, I sat on my childhood bed, phone in hand, uncertain who to call first with the news. In the end, I texted Sarah. Emerson said yes. Moving to Boston in January. Her reply came immediately. "Finally, we'll be in the same city again. Boston better watch out." I smiled, imagining future weekends exploring Boston with Sarah, weekday coffees with Rachel between classes, holidays. Well, holidays were a complication I wasn't ready to untangle. That evening, I added another entry to the journal I'd been keeping since the day of Claire's revelation. "Today, I choose my own path," I wrote. Not the one Claire Sullivan mapped out for me. Not even the one Rachel Shapiro might have chosen if she'd kept me. My own. For the first time, that feels like enough. The transformation wasn't complete. Maybe it never would be. Identity, I was learning, isn't static. It evolves, incorporates new truths, sheds outdated beliefs. But as September melted into October, as my auburn hair grew longer and my paintings grew bolder, I recognized that the greatest change wasn't external at all. It was the quiet confidence growing inside me, the certainty that whoever Emma Sullivan Shapiro turned out to be, she would be authentic. Real. Mine. November arrived with its particular melancholy, bare trees, early darkness, and the first bitter chill of approaching winter. I'd been meeting with Rachel regularly for almost 3 months, each encounter strengthening our tentative bond. We'd progressed from awkward coffees to long walks along the Charles River, from cautious questions to comfortable silences punctuated by laughter. I still hadn't told Claire and Jack about finding her. The secret had grown heavier with each passing week, pressing against my chest whenever I sat at their dinner table or passed Claire in the hallway. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes, a mixture of confusion and hurt in her eyes as she took in my changed appearance, my increasingly independent schedule, my growing distance. The confrontation happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon in mid-November. I'd just returned from Boston, where Rachel had taken me to the MFA to see a special exhibit on female abstract expressionists. The shared day had left me buoyant, filled with a sense of connection I'd been missing my entire life without knowing it. I was in my bedroom unpacking when Claire knocked on my half-open door. Rain streaked the window behind me like tears I refused to shed, casting gloomy shadows across the carpet. "Emma? Can we talk?" Her voice was tentative, almost fragile. She looked smaller somehow, standing in the doorway of the room she'd decorated for me when I was 10, the lavender walls now partially covered with art prints Rachel had helped me select. I nodded, sitting on the edge of my bed. She remained standing, her fingers twisting the wedding band she'd worn for 25 years. "You've been in Boston a lot lately," she began. "Is there something you're not telling us? Or," she hesitated, "someone?" For a split second, I considered another lie, a fictional boyfriend, perhaps, or an art class I'd discovered. The fabrication rose to my lips before I swallowed it back. I was tired of lies, both hers and my own. "I found my birth mother," I said simply. Claire's face drained of color. She gripped the door frame as if to steady herself, her knuckles whitening. "How?" The word was barely audible. "I found the adoption papers in the attic. In August." I kept my voice level, though my heart raced. "Her name is Rachel Shapiro. She teaches at Emerson." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the window. Claire's mouth opened and closed, as if words had deserted her. Finally, she crossed to my desk chair and sank into it, her movements stiff and unnatural. "And you've been seeing her? All this time?" There was no anger in her voice, only a hollow disbelief that was somehow worse. I nodded. "She's been wondering about me for 22 years, I said, a defensive edge creeping into my tone. "She kept all the birthday cards she wrote me but couldn't send. She has the same eyes as me, the same laugh." Each detail seemed to hit Claire like a physical blow. She flinched, her gaze dropping to her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I see," she said, though clearly she didn't. "And this is why you deferred Columbia? To be near her in Boston?" The accusation stung, partly because there was truth in it. "That's not the only reason," I replied. "I'm not the person you raised me to be, Mom. I never was. I just didn't know it until now." "And who are you, exactly?" Her voice trembled between apology and accusation. "This new Emma with the dyed hair and the strange clothes? The one who's been lying to us for months? Who do you think you are?" I rose from the bed, shoulders squared, heart steady in a way it hadn't been since that day in the kitchen. "I'm exactly who I always was," I said. "I'm finally free to be me. Not the version of me you tried to shape into your image." Dad appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the raised voices. His expression darkened as he assessed the scene, Claire near tears, me standing defiant. "What's going on?" he demanded, stepping into the room. Claire looked up at him, her face crumpled. She found her. Her real mother. "Birth mother," I corrected automatically. "And yes, I found Rachel. She's wonderful. She's an English professor. She writes poetry. She never wanted to give me up, but her parents pressured her, and she was only 19, and stop." Dad's voice cut through my rush of words. "Just stop, Emma." The authority in his tone, the tone that had ended arguments throughout my childhood, ignited something fierce within me. I'd spent my life being the good daughter, the obedient one, the girl who never caused trouble. No more. "No, you stop," I shot back. "Stop pretending this isn't happening. Stop acting like you didn't lie to me for 22 years. Stop making this about your feelings when I'm the one whose entire identity was built on a foundation of lies." Dad's face flushed. "We gave you everything," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Everything, Emma. A home, an education, love, except the truth," I interrupted. "You gave me everything except the one thing I had a right to know." I told them about finding the paperwork, the birth certificate with a different name, the search that led me to Rachel. With each sentence, I felt the weight of their disbelief crumble beneath my conviction. Claire's silence grew heavier, more laden with guilt. Dad's anger gradually gave way to something that looked uncomfortably like defeat. "We were going to tell you," Claire finally said, her voice small. "When you were 18. Then when you graduated college. Then, there just never seemed to be a right time. You were happy. We didn't want to disrupt your life. So instead, you waited until I was 22 and dropped it on me like a bomb in the middle of the kitchen," I said. "How is that better?" "It was wrong," Dad admitted, sinking onto the edge of my bed. The longer we waited, the harder it became. Every year that passed made it feel more like a betrayal. "Because it was a betrayal," I said, but the heat had gone out of my words. The defeat in his posture, the tears now silently tracking down Claire's cheeks, they made my anger feel hollow, purposeless. "Does she want custody or something?" Dad asked suddenly, his lawyer's mind apparently jumping to worst-case scenarios. "Is that why you're telling us now?" "Because legally, Dad, I'm 22, I cut him off. No one gets custody of me anymore. And Rachel doesn't want anything except to know me. She's not trying to replace you." I hesitated, then added more gently, "No one could." The acknowledgement hung between us, my first concession that despite everything, they were still my parents. Claire looked up, hope flickering across her tear-stained face. "Then why have you been pulling away from us?" she asked. "Why all the changes, the secrecy? It feels like you're erasing your life with us, Emma." I considered her question seriously, searching for an answer that wouldn't wound but wouldn't compromise my truth either. "I'm not erasing anything," I said finally. "I'm adding to it. I'm discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. That's not a rejection of you, it's just growth." "Growth usually doesn't involve lying to your parents for months," Dad pointed out, but his tone had softened. "You lied to me for years," I countered, but without venom. "Maybe I learned from the best." A silence fell between us, not comfortable but not entirely hostile either. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm that somehow made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "I got accepted to Emerson," I said into the quiet. "Creative writing. I start in January." Claire's sharp intake of breath was the only indication that this news hurt her, another departure from the path she'd envisioned for me. "You'll be near her," she said, not a question but a statement. "I'll be near Rachel," I confirmed, deliberately using her name. "But I'll also be figuring out who I am outside of both my families. That's what I need right now." Dad nodded slowly, his initial anger seemingly replaced by a reluctant understanding. "You're an adult," he said. "We can't stop you from making your own choices, even if we think they're mistakes." "Is that what you think this is?" "A mistake?" I asked, genuinely curious. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I think searching for your birth mother without telling us was a mistake. I think keeping secrets was a mistake." He paused. "But finding her? No. That was probably inevitable. And maybe even necessary." Claire looked at him in surprise, then back at me. Will you tell us about her?" she asked hesitantly. "About Rachel?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected continued resistance, not this tentative olive branch. "Yes," I said after a moment. "I'd like that. She's actually a lot like me. Or I'm like her, I guess." "Of course you are," Claire said softly. "You're her daughter too." The acknowledgement, so simple, so fundamental, nearly undid me. For months, I'd been preparing for a battle that would end with clear winners and losers. Instead, I was facing the possibility of something far more complex, a future where I could be both Emma Sullivan and Emma Shapiro, where being one didn't negate the other. When I walked away from that conversation, it wasn't in anger, but in a kind of liberation. Not the dramatic exit I'd sometimes imagined in darker moments, but a quiet departure from old patterns, old expectations. The finality of my steps echoed through the quiet house, marking the end of a chapter written in lies and the beginning of one authored by truth. That night, I called Rachel from my bedroom, speaking in hushed tones though my door was closed. "I told them," I said without preamble when she answered. "Oh, Emma." Her voice was warm with concern. "How did it go?" I considered the question, watching rain trace patterns on my window. Better than I expected, I admitted. Worse than I hoped. But at least everything's out in the open now. That's usually where healing starts, she said, and I knew she was right. As November deepened toward Thanksgiving, a holiday that now presented unprecedented complications, I faced the reality that confrontation hadn't brought the clean resolution I'd craved. Instead, it had opened a door to something messier, but ultimately more genuine, the possibility of building relationships based not on unquestioning loyalty or biological connection, but on honesty, however belated. December arrived with its familiar rituals, holiday music in every store, the Sullivan family Christmas tree, always purchased the first weekend of the month, and Mom's, Claire's, annual cookie baking marathon. But this year, everything felt different. The consequences of truth had rippled through our lives, changing even the most established traditions. Claire tried to bridge the gap with small gestures, a coffee left on the kitchen counter when I slept late, a text checking if I'd be home for dinner, the occasional tentative question about my art classes. I responded kindly but kept my distance, honoring the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish. I'm thinking of making the rugula this year, she said one evening as I helped her unpack groceries. The Jewish cookie with the nuts and cinnamon. I found a recipe online. The gesture was so transparent, so clearly an attempt to acknowledge my newly discovered heritage that I wasn't sure whether to be touched or irritated. You don't have to do that, I said, arranging apples in the fruit bowl. The usual Christmas cookies are fine. She placed a bag of flour in the pantry, her movements careful, deliberate. I want to, she said quietly. I want to include all of who you are now. The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. I'd prepared myself for resistance, even resentment, not this careful acceptance. Thank you, I said finally. Maybe we could make them together? Rachel showed me her grandmother's recipe. Claire's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work. I'd like that, she said, and I knew how much that simple response had cost her. Dad's approach was more direct. One snowy evening, he knocked on my bedroom door, a manila folder in hand. These are copies of all the legal documents related to your adoption, he said, handing me the folder. Birth certificate, adoption papers, everything. You should have them. I took the folder, recognizing it as the peace offering it was. Thanks, Dad. He nodded, hesitating in the doorway. Your mother, Claire, she made mistakes. We both did. But she loves you, Emma. More than you can understand until you have children of your own someday. I know she does, I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. Claire's love had never been the issue. It was her fear of losing me that had led to the deception. Dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with emotional terrain. Well, that's all I wanted to say. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and we'd like to meet her. Rachel, when you're ready. The offer stunned me. Really? His expression was wry. It won't be the most comfortable Thanksgiving dinner ever, but yes. She's part of your life now. That makes her part of ours too, in some way. The idea of my two worlds colliding, Rachel and Claire in the same room, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. I'll think about it, I promised. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Jack learned, painfully, that love withheld could not be reclaimed by mere apology. Trust, once broken, mended slowly, if at all. I no longer shared every detail of my life with them. I spent weekends in Boston with Rachel without reporting back. I made decisions about my future without seeking their approval first. It's like she's a different person, I overheard Claire telling Dad one night, her voice drifting up the stairwell. I don't know how to reach her anymore. She was always this person, Dad replied, his tone gentler than I'd expected. We just never let her show us. Their learning curve was steep, but so was mine. I discovered that embracing Rachel didn't require rejecting Claire and Jack. That forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. That family could be complicated and messy and still, somehow, family. My life blossomed in unexpected ways. Through Rachel, I reconnected with extended family I'd never known. Aunt Leah in Providence, whose laugh matched mine exactly. Cousins in Chicago who shared my artistic tendencies. Uncle David in Miami. who sent me old photos of my maternal grandfather playing violin in a jazz quartet. These new connections weren't just curiosities, they were revelations, filling in blanks in my personal history I hadn't even known existed. The Sullivan family traditions I'd grown up with, Dad's elaborate 4th of July barbecues, summer vacations in Cape Cod, Mom's obsession with Easter egg hunts, were joined by Shapiro rituals, Passover seders, Jewish New Year celebrations, Friday night Shabbat dinners when I visited Rachel. My identity expanded to embrace both worlds, not through obligation but through choice. In January, I moved to Boston to start at Emerson. My small apartment in Allston became the physical manifestation of my dual heritage, bookshelves filled with volumes from both my families, walls decorated with art inspired by both my histories, a kitchen where I practiced both Claire's chocolate chip cookie recipe and Rachel's grandmother's matzo ball soup. Sarah, true to her word, helped me navigate my new city, introducing me to her favorite cafes and bookstores. "You seem happier," she observed one evening as we walked along the Esplanade, watching ice floes drift down the Charles River. "More you somehow." "I feel more me," I agreed, my breath clouding in the January cold. Like I've been looking at my reflection through foggy glass all my life, and someone finally wiped it clear. My creative writing program challenged and inspired me. I found myself drawing on both my backgrounds and my work, stories about belonging and disconnection, about secrets and revelations, about the complex tapestry of identity. My professors praised my authentic voice, unaware of how hard-won that authenticity had been. Rachel kept a respectful distance, careful not to overwhelm me with her presence now that we lived in the same city. "You need to establish your own life here," she said when I apologized for not seeing her more often. "I've waited 22 years. I can be patient a little longer." Her understanding only deepened my appreciation for her. We settled into a comfortable routine of Sunday brunches and occasional museum visits, building our relationship one conversation at a time. In March, I met Ethan in a poetry workshop at Emerson. With his quiet intensity and thoughtful questions, he drew me out of my usual reserve. Our first date, coffee at a tiny cafe in the South End, turned into a 6-hour conversation that ranged from childhood memories to literary theory to the best pizza in Boston. "My family situation is complicated," I warned him on our third date, reluctant to scare him off but unwilling to hide my truth. He'd smiled, pushing his glasses up his nose in a gesture I already found endearing. "Whose isn't?" "My parents divorced when I was 8, then both remarried people who already had kids. I have step-siblings, half-siblings, and steps of steps. I need a flowchart for family gatherings." His easy acceptance of complexity made space for mine. When I finally explained my full story, the revelation, the search, the discovery, he listened without judgment. "That's quite a journey," was all he said when I finished. "Thank you for sharing it with me." In April, for my 23rd birthday, Rachel suggested something unprecedented, a joint celebration with both families. "Only if you're comfortable," she added quickly. I just thought, it might be nice for everyone to meet. The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. "I don't know if they're ready," I said, thinking of Claire's still fragile acceptance of my relationship with Rachel. "Ask them," Rachel suggested. "The worst they can say is no." To my surprise, Claire and Jack agreed immediately. "Of course we'll come," Claire said when I called. "It's your birthday. And it's time we met Rachel." The birthday dinner took place at a neutral location, a restaurant in Cambridge with private dining rooms and excellent food. I arrived early, stomach churning with anxiety. What if they hated each other? What if the conversation was unbearably awkward? What if this experiment in blended family dynamics failed spectacularly? Claire and Jack arrived first, bearing carefully wrapped presents and nervous smiles. Dad hugged me tightly. Claire adjusted my necklace with familiar maternal fussiness. "You look beautiful," she said, studying my face as if memorizing it. "Happy." Rachel arrived moments later with Ruth, my newly discovered grandmother. The initial introductions were stiff, formal, two sets of parents assessing each other across an invisible divide. Thank you for raising such an amazing daughter, Rachel said to Claire and Jack, breaking the ice with unexpected grace. I see how much of her goodness comes from you. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for finding the courage to meet her, she replied, and for sharing her with us now. The evening wasn't perfect. There were awkward pauses, careful navigations around potentially difficult topics, moments when I caught Claire watching Rachel interact with me, pain briefly visible in her eyes. But there were also moments of genuine connection, Dad and Rachel discovering a shared passion for obscure jazz musicians, Ruth and Claire exchanging recipes, everyone laughing at embarrassing stories about my childhood and apparent genetic clumsiness, inherited straight from Rachel. As I blew out the candles on my cake, baked by Claire, but featuring the raspberry filling Rachel remembered I'd loved in our first meetings, I made a silent wish not for myself, but for all of us, for healing, for understanding, for the grace to forge a new kind of family from the broken pieces of the old. Looking back now, I see that the moment Claire told me I wasn't her real daughter became the catalyst for becoming exactly who I was always meant to be. The path from that Sunday afternoon in the kitchen to this new life wasn't straightforward. It twisted through pain and discovery, confrontation and consequence. But each step, however difficult, led me closer to wholeness. I am Emma Sullivan Shapiro now, not half one and half the other, but wholly both, finding strength in the complexity of my origins rather than confusion. I carry Claire's resilience and Jack's sense of justice alongside Rachel's creativity and my grandfather's musical ear. I am a mosaic of many gifts, some inherited by blood, others by years of nurturing. The greatest consequence of Claire's confession wasn't loss, it was liberation. Freedom to embrace the fullness of who I am, to build a life not limited by secrets or shaped by others' fears. Freedom to love all my parents, imperfect as they are, and to be loved in return, not as the daughter they imagined, but as the woman I've become. And that, I've discovered, is the most powerful consequence of all, the space to become yourself, completely and without apology. The truth may have shattered my world, but from those fragments, I've built something stronger, a life that's authentically, unquestionably mine.